He was supposed to be dead. At least that's what everyone believed when Ethan Walker's still body was carried out of the Montana woods. But the moment the funeral began, Ranger the German shepherd, who once trusted him with his life, did something no one could explain. He leapt into the coffin and refused to let anyone near. Then he growled at a fellow officer, as if accusing him. Within hours, Ranger's strange behavior would lead investigators to a hidden truth, a truth someone powerful was willing to kill for. Before we start, make sure to hit, like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. The morning sky over northern Montana was a sheet of dull silver, heavy with mist, and the quiet chill of a land that had learned to keep its secrets. The small wooden chapel on Pine Ridge Hill sat half buried in fog, its steeple a dark silhouette against the muted horizon. Inside, the air felt colder than the world outside, and every whisper seemed to echo longer than it should. People gathered in stiff coats, speaking in hushed tones, as they waited to say goodbye to a man most of them never truly knew. Ethan Walker, 45 years old, a recluse whose life had been reduced to rumors and sparse sightings. He lay motionless in an open casket at the front of the chapel. Ethan's tall frame, 1.82 meters, looked thinner than many remembered. His face, usually rugged and sharply defined, seemed softer in stillness. The rough scruff that usually shadowed his jaw was trimmed out of respect, but faint lines of worry remained etched across his forehead. His dark brown hair, slightly long and brushing the nape of his neck, still carried streaks of silver near the temples. Even in death, or what everyone believed was death, Ethan looked like a man who had lived with ghosts far longer than any human should. Officer Mark Hughes, standing near the front row, shifted uneasily. A man in his late 40s with a square jaw, thinning blonde hair, and the build of someone who lived on too much black coffee and not enough sleep. Mark had known Ethan from years back, before Ethan withdrew from society, before he vanished into the Montana woods with only his thoughts and a battered leather coat. Mark remembered Ethan as a kind but distant man, one who offered help easily, but spoke very little about himself. Something about this funeral gnawed at him like a loose thread tugging at the corner of his mind. The report said Ethan had been found collapsed near a frozen creek, no pulse, body ice cold, likely dead for hours. The medical examiner signed off quickly, too quickly, Mark realized now. As the pastor began his opening words, the chapel doors suddenly slammed open with a violent thud that made everyone flinch. A gust of cold air swept inside, but that wasn't what froze the room. It was the massive German shepherd standing at the entrance. Ranger was 5 years old, large even for his breed, with thick black and tan fur and dark eyes sharp enough to cut through steel. Once a decorated K-9 in the county's search and rescue unit, Ranger had worked with Ethan years ago when Ethan volunteered during wildfire seasons. The two had formed an unlikely bond, quiet man, disciplined dog, but after Ethan withdrew from society, Ranger had been reassigned. Or so people assumed. No one expected him to be here. No one expected what happened next. Ranger let out a low, trembling sound halfway between a growl and a whine, then charged down the chapel aisle before anyone could react. "Hey, grab him!" Someone shouted, but it was useless. Ranger moved with the force of something driven by instinct, far deeper than fear. He leaped onto the platform and landed beside the coffin with a thump that rattled the wooden stand. Gasps erupted. The pastor stumbled backward. Several men jumped from their seats. Before anyone could intervene, Ranger shoved his nose against Ethan's chest, nuzzling, pushing, as if trying to wake him. His body trembled. A raw, agonizing whimper escaped his throat. Then the sound changed, anger cutting through grief. When the first officer approached, Ranger snapped his head up and released a deep, feral growl that echoed through the chapel like thunder. "He's gone crazy," a woman screamed. "Get that dog out of here," shouted another. But Mark didn't move. He watched Ranger closely, too closely. Ranger wasn't just being protective, he was correcting something. Warning. Ranger pressed his head against Ethan again, harder this time, as if refusing to accept the stillness of the man in the coffin. And then suddenly Ranger lifted his head, ears pricking sharply. He stared toward the back of the chapel. Not a glance, an accusation. Mark followed the dog's gaze and felt his stomach tighten. Officer Derek Cole stood near the last row, his hands stiff at his sides. Derek was in his early 30s, tall, lean, with neatly combed dark hair, and a face that always seemed too smooth, too composed, as if he practiced his expressions before using them. He was the officer who found Ethan's body, the officer who filed the report, the officer who claimed it was a simple accident. But now Derek looked pale, a thin sheen of sweat forming on his brow. His eyes darted to the exit, then back to Ranger, then away again, as if looking at the dog burned him. Ranger's growl deepened, vibrating across the floor. The sound was low, primal, and filled with something Mark recognized, not grief, recognition. Mark's breath caught. He knew dogs didn't behave like this without reason. Ranger had been trained for years to read danger lies and threats in ways humans couldn't. And right now, Ranger's eyes were locked onto Derek as though he was the one thing in this room that didn't belong. Derek swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. Mark saw it. Ranger felt it. The chapel felt smaller, darker, as though the truth was standing in the room waiting to be acknowledged. Mark took a step forward and whispered, barely audible, "What do you know, boy?" Ranger didn't look away from Derek. His fur bristled, his muscles tensed, his teeth showed. Fear rippled through the audience. But Mark felt something else entirely, certainty. Ethan Walker might not be as dead as people believed, and Ranger was telling them something they weren't ready to hear. The funeral no longer felt like a farewell. It felt like the beginning of something far more dangerous. The wind rolled cold over the quiet streets of Pine Ridge, before sunrise brushing frost against the windows of the small sheriff's substation, like a warning no one wanted to hear. Inside the dim hallway, lit only by emergency lights, Officer Mark Hughes moved with the grim focus of a man wrestling with something he could no longer ignore. His boots echoed heavily across the floor, and every step carried the weight of the chaotic funeral. From the night before, Ranger's growls, Derek Cole's pale, twitching face, and the sense that Ethan Walker's death was wrapped in something far darker than an accident. Mark pushed open the door to the records room and flicked on a flickering lamp. Files were stacked on old metal shelves, dust hanging in the chilly air, but one folder, Ethan Walker Incident Report, lay front and center on the table, where Mark had reviewed it the night before. He sat down, jaw clenched, and forced himself to go through it again. The more he read, the more wrong everything felt. Derek Cole's handwriting was clean, neat, almost rehearsed. The report described a simple scene. Ethan slipped near a rocky slope in the forest, hit his head, and succumbed to the cold before help arrived. But the details were too tidy, like someone had written the story of a dead man instead of documenting a crime. Mark rubbed his temples, frustration tightening in his chest. He remembered Derek from years before, a promising officer with a polished look, too polished as if he cared more about his image than the job. Derek was in his early 30s, tall and well-kept, with perfectly styled dark hair, and skin always smooth as though untouched by real work. Even his uniform looked like it had never seen dirt. But Mark also remembered a rumor, the kind everyone heard, but no one investigated, that Derek struggled under pressure. He panicked. He cracked when things didn't go his way. And now, remembering Ranger's eyes locked onto Derek, Mark felt his certainty growing. Something about the young officer didn't belong anywhere near Ethan's case. "Why were you even in that forest?" Mark muttered at the file, though the man he was questioning wasn't there. According to the assignment logs, Derek hadn't been dispatched anywhere near Ethan's cabin that day. His patrol route was in the opposite direction of town. No call redirected him. No emergency demanded his presence, and yet Derek claimed he just happened to be nearby when he found the body. Convenient. Too convenient. Mark flipped through the next page photos of Ethan's injuries. Bruises across the ribs, a cut along the jawline. Shallow but patterned abrasions on the back of his shoulder. None of it aligned with the idea of a simple fall. After 2 decades on the force, Mark had seen more accidental injuries than he could count, and Ethan's didn't match any of them. They looked like something else, something inflicted. A low growl suddenly broke the silence. Mark stiffened and turned toward the hallway. Ranger stood there, the large German shepherd silhouette filling the doorway. His thick black and tan coat looked dull under the emergency lights, and his ribs moved sharply with each breath, a clear sign he hadn't eaten since the funeral. His eyes, dark and intense, fixed on Mark with desperate urgency. Mark rose quickly. Ranger. But the dog wasn't looking for comfort. He pushed into the room, sniffed the table, the floor, Mark's sleeves, then the air. His entire body stiffened. A soft whine rumbled deep in his throat before he turned abruptly and bolted out the door. Hey, Mark grabbed his jacket and sprinted after him. Ranger tore through the hallway claws, scraping against the linoleum floor, then crashed through the substation's front doors and into the freezing dawn. The wind bit Mark's face as he chased Ranger down the silent street. Ranger slowed down, but Ranger didn't stop. He stayed low to the ground, nose tracking a scent with precision and fury, weaving between houses and across frost-coated lawns. Then he halted, suddenly, violently. Mark followed the line of his gaze and felt his stomach drop. A black SUV sat parked in the shadows between 2 houses. Even in dim light, Mark recognized it, the county-issued vehicle that Derek Cole drove. Ranger's entire body bristled. The dog stepped forward slowly, growling low in his chest, teeth flashing in the pale morning light. Mark approached the SUV cautiously, heart-hammering. Ranger had worked crime scenes for years. He knew scents. He knew lies. And the sound coming from him now wasn't confusion. It was certainty. "You've smelled this before?" Mark whispered. "On Ethan." Ranger barked sharply, loud enough to echo across the street, then slammed both paws against the SUV door. He sniffed violently, whining, growling, pacing. Mark pressed his hand to the cold metal dread crawling through him. He scanned the surrounding houses. They were dark, sleeping, unaware. As he reached for the door handle, Ranger stepped closer, pressing his shoulder against Mark's leg, as if urging him to understand what he already knew. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Ethan Walker hadn't fallen. He hadn't slipped. Someone wanted him gone. And Ranger, the one creature Ethan trusted without words, had just led Mark straight to the first piece of the truth. Mark looked down at the dog, voice low and steady. "All right, boy," he breathed. "I believe you now." Ranger didn't blink. He only growled at the SUV, cold, certain, accusing, and Mark finally understood. The story Derek Cole told them was never meant to explain Ethan's death. It was meant to hide someone's intent. Someone who had just made a mistake. Someone who didn't expect a dog to come back. The late afternoon light over northern Montana dimmed into a cold amber haze, the kind that stretched long shadows across the hillsides and made the wind sound like it carried old secrets through the trees. Officer Mark Hughes guided his truck up the narrow dirt road leading to Ethan Walker's cabin, the engine rumbling nervously beneath him, as if sharing the unease building in his chest. In the passenger seat, Ranger sat perfectly still, his dark eyes locked forward, ears perked, posture stiff with unwavering purpose. Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter. He couldn't stop thinking about the SUV belonging to Officer Derek Cole. the blatant tension in Ranger's growl, and the gnawing realization that every official document he had reviewed was nothing but a carefully crafted lie. The higher he climbed up the hill, the more he felt as though he was driving straight into the life Ethan never allowed anyone to see. When they reached the ridge, Ethan's cabin emerged from behind a cluster of pine trees, a small weathered wooden house with faded red shutters and a metal chimney that hadn't breathed smoke in years. The boards were worn and splintered but sturdy. Like Ethan himself before the world pushed him into silence. Mark stepped out of the truck boots, crunching over frost-covered earth. Ranger hopped down immediately, nose low, tail rigid. The dog inhaled deeply and a low rumble vibrated from his chest. Mark paused, feeling his heartbeat slow and thicken. "Someone's been here," he whispered. He wasn't talking to Ranger, but the dog responded anyway, ears angling sharply toward the cabin, as if confirming it. Mark approached the front door. The lock had been forced, not broken, but manipulated the subtle scratch marks around the keyhole, revealing someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Ethan," Mark muttered under his breath, a heavy ache pulling through him. For 12 years, Ethan Walker lived here alone. No friends, no guests, no one but Ranger occasionally during their years working together on wildfire rescues. Ethan always claimed someone was watching him. Mark had dismissed it, then chalked it up to isolation and trauma. But standing here now, facing a door that had been tampered with, he felt the sting of guilt carve into him. Inside the cabin, the air smelled like dust pine wood, and something colder fear lingering in the walls. Ethan's belongings were still scattered the way he always left them. A worn leather coat draped over a chair, a pair of old boots by the hearth, a stack of notebooks filled with his neat handwriting. Ethan had always been a meticulous man, quiet but observant, thoughtful, the type who watched others more than he spoke. His trauma had shaped him the betrayal a decade ago that cost him everything. It was the reason he walked away from his volunteer work with the sheriff's department, and the reason he vanished into the woods. Ranger trotted through the cabin, sniffing aggressively until he stopped at the back door, where deep grooves marked the wooden floor. Mark crouched and studied them. Bootprints definitely not Ethan's. Ethan's boots were wide worn, always leaving a distinctive shape. These prints were narrower, cleaner, and fresh enough to turn Mark's stomach. The back door creaked as Mark pushed it open. A faint trail in the snow led to a small storage shed behind the house, one Ethan had built himself from scrap wood and determination. Ranger sprinted ahead, barking once, sharp and insistent. The shed door hung slightly open. Mark entered carefully. The inside smelled strongly of oiled, damp earth, and something acrid like a piece of a story burned away before someone could read it. Ethan's tools were scattered, but that wasn't what caught Mark's eye. Mounted high on the back wall was an empty metal bracket, freshly scratched. Ethan had once installed a cheap security camera there after claiming someone had tried to break in. The camera was now gone, or rather dismantled. On a small table beneath the bracket lay pieces of the device wires. Yanked out, casing cracked, the memory card removed and tossed aside as if someone didn't care enough to destroy it properly. Mark picked up the card, turning it between his fingers. "This shouldn't be here," he murmured. Ranger let out a sharp bark and pawed at a worn jacket tossed carelessly on a box. Mark lifted it. It was Ethan's heavy work jacket, brown lined with fleece, but something was wrong. The shoulder seam was ripped open, exposing threads and fibers that didn't belong. Embedded in the tear was a strand of dark fabric, smooth, synthetic, nothing like Ethan's rough outdoor clothing. Mark pocketed it. His pulse started racing. Ethan didn't tear easily. Someone grabbed him. Someone pulled him by the jacket with enough force to rip it open, and someone chased him before he collapsed in the woods. Mark followed Ranger to the corner of the shed, where an old wooden crate sat partially open. Inside were stacks of papers, bound notebooks, and a USB drive taped to the side. Mark sifted through them. Newspaper clippings, photocopies of official documents, names highlighted, timelines, complaints filed. One name appeared again and again: Assistant Chief Robert Avery. Avery was a tall, heavy-set man in his mid-50s with slick gray hair and a face carved into a permanent mask of authority. His pale blue eyes were sharp, the eyes of someone who measured a room in terms of advantage, not humanity. Avery had a reputation for intimidation, subtle, quiet, but lethal. And Ethan had been collecting evidence against him. Mark exhaled shakily. Ethan wasn't paranoid. He was right. Ranger suddenly growled deep and dark, pulling Mark out of his thoughts. The dog stared at the far corner of the shed, nose twitching, body trembling with recognition. Mark grabbed the memory card from the table and plugged it into a small portable reader he found among Ethan's tools. The screen flickered to life. A grainy video appeared. Snow. Movement. Ethan stepping out the back door. A figure emerging behind him. A strike. Ethan falling to his knees. The figure stepped closer just enough for the camera to catch a partial angle of the man's jaw, cheek, and eyes. Ranger snarled viciously. Mark froze. He knew those features. Ranger knew that scent. The same one he reacted to at the funeral. The same one he led Mark to that morning. The same one standing in the chapel pretending to mourn. Officer Derek Cole. Mark's chest tightened. Derek didn't just find Ethan's body. Derek put it there. And Ranger had recognized his attacker from the start. A thin veil of clouds drifted over Montana's late evening sky, casting a dim blue-gray glow across the valley as Officer Mark Hughes drove back toward town. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs, but the chill had nothing on the pressure building inside his chest. Beside him in the passenger seat, Ranger sat stiff and alert, occasionally letting out a sharp breath, as if he too sensed the shift in the air like a storm no one could outrun. Mark replayed the cabin footage in his mind. For the 100th time, Ethan Walker collapsing, a figure stepping out of the shadows, the unmistakable jawline and cheekbone of Officer Derek Cole, and Ranger's instant recognition. But something else gnawed at him harder: the documents, the highlighted names, and the repeated marks around one-man Assistant Chief Robert Avery. Even the name felt heavy now, like a stone sitting on his lungs. Mark parked behind the sheriff's substation, where the lights inside flickered weakly. He took a deep breath and entered through the back door. Ranger followed closely, nails clicking against the linoleum floor. The station was quiet at this hour, the kind of silence that scratched at nerves. Only one office had its lights on. The glass read, Assistant Chief Robert Avery. Avery was inside, standing at his desk, arms crossed behind his back, staring at a wall lined with commendations and plaques. The man was hard to ignore, tall, broad-shouldered, built like someone who had spent his youth lifting more than paperwork. His hair was gray, neatly slicked back, matching the cold steel in his pale blue eyes. His face was carved with sharp lines, the kind that came not from aging but from decades of authority. He was a man who expected obedience and punished defiance. When Avery turned, his expression was polite, rehearsed, but there was something predatory beneath it, like a wolf wearing its Sunday best. Officer Hughes, he said calmly. You're here late. Mark swallowed the instinct to step back as Ranger stiffened beside him, growling under his breath. I needed to look into something, Mark replied carefully. Avery's gaze flicked down to Ranger. That dog is out of control lately. Mark didn't answer. Ranger's growl deepened. Avery's eyes narrowed. Control your animal, he said, voice sharp. Mark placed a hand on Ranger's back, but the dog didn't break eye contact with Avery. Something passed between them, silent, hostile, ancient in its simplicity. Recognition. Ranger knew this scent. Mark forced a stiff nod and stepped out of the office, heart racing as he retreated. He returned to the evidence room, closed the door, and pulled out the new findings. More inconsistencies, more lies, more threads leading right back to Avery. Ethan Walker hadn't been paranoid. He had been hunted. Mark opened Ethan's wooden evidence box again. Inside were the documents he'd collected over years, patterns of case manipulations, sudden closures, missing evidence officers reassigned or fired without explanation. And at the center of every pattern, Avery. Ethan had been a volunteer support officer, then someone with a sharp mind and a quiet demeanor, easy to overlook but not easy to fool. 13 years ago, Ethan discovered discrepancies in several internal case files. He filed an anonymous report, but Avery found out. After that, Ethan resigned, abruptly. He vanished into the woods. And now Mark knew why. Avery didn't tolerate those who spoke. Mark rubbed his forehead, anger knotting his stomach. All these years, Ethan wasn't hiding from the world, he was hiding from Avery. A sudden clang startled Mark. Ranger was pawing at the metal shelf near the evidence lockers, whining insistently. "What is it, boy?" Mark followed Ranger as the dog shoved his head into a low storage compartment. Mark reached inside and pulled out a thick plastic bag marked "Recovered from Cole's vehicle." He spread the contents across the table. A torn fiber caught his eye. Dark gray synthetic, same texture as the strand he found lodged in Ethan's ripped jacket. Mark compared them. Perfect match. He grabbed the GPS logs next. Derek Cole's SUV had recorded a route that didn't match the dispatch logs. But the timestamps, they had Avery's signature all over them, literally. The GPS override code belonged to Avery's authorization credentials. Derek Cole alone couldn't have falsified the data. He needed Avery. Mark felt his throat tighten. It wasn't Derek's plan. It was Avery's. Derek was the weapon. Avery was the hand that aimed it. "God," Mark whispered. Ranger pressed against him, sensing his turmoil. Before Mark could process further, Ranger jerked his head toward the exit door, ears pinned back, tail stiff. The dog sniffed the air and growled, deep warning, protective. "You smell him," Mark breathed. "Avery." Ranger barked once and bolted from the room. Mark grabbed a flashlight and raced after him, heart pounding as Ranger led him out of the building, across the parking lot, through a narrow alley, and toward the edge of town where abandoned sheds and storage units sat forgotten. Ranger sprinted ahead, nose glued to the ground, then stopped sharply at an old metal storage shed with peeling paint and a rusted padlock. The dog barked furious, pawing the door, as if demanding it open. Mark's hands shook as he forced the lock with a crowbar. The door creaked open. The smell hit him first, damp mold, and something unsettlingly familiar, Ethan's scent. Ranger barreled inside. Mark followed and froze. Ethan's belongings were spread across the room, his missing boots, the broken compass he always carried, his thermos, his old flannel shirt, and the tattered notepad he used in the woods. All hidden away, taken from him. Mark stared, horror crawling up his spine. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't random. Someone collected these items. Someone wanted to erase Ethan's trail. Someone wanted him gone. Ranger's growl rumbled through the shed. Mark turned slowly, fully understanding the magnitude of what he was seeing. The man behind Ethan's disappearance wasn't Derek Cole. Derek was merely a pawn. The architect of everything, the lies, the silence, the attack, was Assistant Chief Robert Avery. A pale, washed-out dawn crept over Montana as thin streaks of light pierced the freezing mist outside the Pine Ridge Sheriff Substation. Officer Mark Hughes hadn't slept. His mind had spun relentlessly through the night, replaying every piece of evidence, every lie, every moment Ethan Walker had been alone in those woods. Avery now sat in a holding cell, his expression somewhere between fury and disbelief, while Derek Cole lay trembling in an interrogation room, confessing in broken fragments. But even with the truth exposed, Mark felt no relief, only a weight in his chest so heavy he could barely breathe. Because none of this mattered if Ethan was truly gone. Ranger paced outside the substation door, massive frame tense, ears pinned back, as if listening to something Mark couldn't hear. The dog had refused to rest, refused food, refused everything but staying near the places Ethan had been. Mark knelt beside him, running a weary hand over Ranger's thick fur. "I'm sorry, boy. I should have believed him sooner." Ranger didn't react. His nose twitched, his body stiffened, and suddenly he threw his head back and let out a sharp, piercing howl. Mark jolted upright. The howl didn't sound like grief. It sounded like recognition. Something alive. Something returning. Before Mark could process the thought, Ranger lunged forward, grabbing the sleeve of Mark's jacket with his teeth and pulling harder than he ever had before. Ranger, what the hell? But the dog was relentless. He tugged again, barking urgently, then took off toward town, forcing Mark to sprint after him. They tore through icy streets, past shuttered shops and frost-lined sidewalks. Ranger moved like he was following a beacon, only he could sense his muscles rippling under his coat, breath steaming in the cold air. Mark was panting by the time they reached the front steps of Montana Regional Medical Center, a large square building of pale stone and glass that glowed faintly under the rising sun. Ranger bolted inside before anyone could stop him. Mark shouted apologies to startled nurses as he chased the German Shepherd down a hallway, smelling of antiseptic and winter air. Ranger slowed down. But the dog didn't slow. He halted only when he skidded to a stop in front of room 1-13. A nurse stepped out at that moment. Nurse Helen Carter, a woman in her early 50s with strawberry blonde hair pulled into a messy bun, warm brown eyes magnified by square glasses, and a tired kindness etched into the lines around her mouth. She wore pale blue scrubs and a thick, knitted cardigan, her posture calm despite the sudden commotion. "Officer Hughes?" she asked, startled but composed. "We were just calling you." Mark froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. "Why, what happened?" Nurse Carter glanced toward the room, her voice lowering. "It's about Ethan Walker." Mark felt the floor tilt beneath him. Ranger whined softly, pushing his body against the slightly open door tail, trembling. The nurse hesitated for a heartbeat before stepping aside. "He's alive," she whispered. Mark didn't hear anything else. He pushed the door open, breath caught halfway up his throat. The room was dim, lit only by a soft monitor glow and pale morning light filtering through blinds. Machines hummed quietly. Blankets rustled. And on the bed, Ethan Walker lay breathing. Shallow, weak, but breathing. His eyes were closed, skin still ghostly pale, but color had begun seeping back into his cheeks. The IV line in his arm dripped steadily. His chest rose and fell with fragile rhythm. Ranger climbed onto the edge of the bed in one smooth motion, as if drawn by invisible gravity. He pressed his head against Ethan's sternum, the same place he had nuzzled during the funeral, the same spot he had refused to leave. Ethan's eyelids twitched. Mark leaned forward, barely able to breathe. "Ethan." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Ethan's eyes fluttered open, revealing the cold gray irises that had once watched the world with quiet suspicion and silent resilience. They moved slowly, unsteady, as if searching for something familiar in a world he had been forced to leave behind. His voice cracked like dry branches under snow. "Ranger, you found me." The words were barely audible, but they pierced the room with the force of a thunderclap. Ranger's entire body shook. A sound came from him, a mixture of relief and heartbreak, a soft, broken whine that only a creature who had nearly lost everything could make. Ethan lifted a trembling hand. His fingers brushed the top of Ranger's head, then curled weakly into the dog's fur. "Good boy." Mark stepped closer, feeling tears sting his eyes, though he refused to let them fall. Ethan looked different, older, more worn, the ordeal carved into every line of his face. The bruises along his neck were stark. His lips were cracked. But there was something fierce in his eyes again, a fire trying to reignite. "You're safe now," Mark said quietly. Ethan let out a shaky breath, though pain flickered across his features. "Doesn't feel like it?" Mark pulled a chair closer. "Avery and Cole are in custody." The name Avery made Ethan's eyes harden, as if recalling a nightmare that had haunted him for 13 years. "He didn't expect you to survive," Mark continued. "Or for Ranger to expose him." Ethan's jaw clenched weakly. He'd tried before. And Mark understood. Avery hadn't tried to silence Ethan once he had been hunting him for years. Ranger pressed closer as if shielding Ethan from the memory. Nurse Carter entered briefly, checking Ethan's vitals, then stepped out quietly, giving them space. Mark sat silently studying Ethan, the man who had lived in isolation for more than a decade. The man everyone believed had no one, yet the only creature he trusted had refused to let the world bury him. Ranger nudged Ethan gently and rested his head across the man's chest, closing his eyes. Ethan whispered, voice still hoarse. "Did he stop trying?" Mark shook his head. "He will now." For the first time since the nightmare began, Ethan's expression softened. His eyes drifted shut again, not in defeat, but in fragile, cautious relief. Ranger stayed perfectly still, guarding him with the same devotion that had carried him through death's doorway. Mark watched them, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. Avery's lies had fallen. Cole's betrayal was exposed. And Ethan quiet, wounded, forgotten. Ethan had been brought back not by luck, but by the loyalty of a dog who refused to give up. Mark exhaled a slow breath. "You did it, Ranger." The dog didn't move, but the trembling in his body eased. In the quiet hospital room, as dawn fully broke outside, Mark finally understood what Ethan had been to Ranger. Not a forgotten man. Not a recluse, but the one person the dog had chosen to protect at all costs. The man the world abandoned. The man Ranger refused to lose a second time. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as bright lights from the heavens. Sometimes they come on 4 legs, carrying a loyalty only God himself could plant in a creature's heart. Ethan's return reminds us that even in our darkest valleys, the Lord is still working quietly, guiding us back to life through the love around us. If this story touched you, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so more people can witness these blessings. May God watch over you and your family, protect your steps, and remind you that no one is ever truly alone.